How did the American film industry and government defer in the encouragement of multiculturalism in the 1980s? Multiculturalism is a disputed term. Ali Ratanzi states in Multiculturalism, a very short introduction, that an acceptable definition of multiculturalism has been notoriously elusive. According to the Oxford Dictionary of English, however, it is the state or condition of being multicultural, the preservation of different cultures or cultural identities within unified society, as a state or nation. Conversely, Bhikkhu Parekh writes in Rethinking Multiculturalism that multiculturalism is not about difference in identity per se, but those that are embedded in and sustained by culture. There are two major schools of thought on multiculturalism, mainly whether it represents a homogenization of diverse cultures or a celebration of that very diversity. Due to this elusiveness, however, we will utilize the dictionary definition of the term for the duration of this essay. Regarding this multiculturalism, the Reagan administration did not encourage it during the 1980s, as they explicitly ignored it. While Hollywood did address multiculturalism, we will argue that it did so in a way that did not actually encourage it at all. The battle over multiculturalism was the main cultural conflict in America in the 1980s, and its repercussions continue to be felt across all platforms. We will focus on two further central conflicts occurring in the 1980s in America. The first is contrasting the American film industry, centered in Hollywood, with the federal government based in Washington, D.C. with the Reagan administration, and the respective encouragement or disencouragement of multiculturalism. The second conflict refers to the global context surrounding the United States at this time, with a fight over whether militarism or multiculturalism most drove the country at this time, and in the years since.
Dago Wab, Guinea, garlic bread, pizza slinging, spaghetti bending, Victor Mon, Perry Como, Luciano Pavarotti, solo meal, non-singer motherfucker.
You gold teeth, gold chain wearing, fried chicken and biscuit eating, monkey, ape, baboon, big thigh, fast running, high jumping, spear chucking, 360-degree basketball dunking, titsoon, spade, mullignan. Take your fucking pizza and go the fuck back to Africa. You little...
This clip portrays an attitude within Do the Right Thing, which neglected to respect or encourage any individual culture, portraying each with such disdain that it achieved almost the opposite of multiculturalism, ironically, with the same results. This level playing field would come to be seen in Hollywood as the 1990s commenced, prompting a multiculturalism that embraced every creed, sexuality, race, or gender. In the 1980s, however, the only equalizing portrayal of multiculturalism could be found in Washington, D.C., within the Reagan administration. In contrast to what was happening in Hollywood at the time, the federal government within the Reagan administration did not support or encourage multiculturalism. Indeed, it essentially neglected to address it at all. This ignoring of the topic caused Reagan and his supporters to embrace the standard white male America, in a pattern that reversed much of what had been happening in the country. Beginning in the 1960s and continuing through the Vietnam War protest era of the 1970s, the conservatism of the 1950s was soundly rejected as the baby boom generation came of age. This resulted in such social movements as the aforementioned war protests, the seminal civil rights movement, and the advent of gay liberation areas, mainly in San Francisco and New York. Following these two general decades, however, where the rhetoric was soundly liberal but failing in regards to legislative application and economic and militarist concentration, Ronald Reagan was elected. In a manner which appeared to take him almost straight from Hollywood to politics, this former actor was awarded the role of a lifetime as he became president. Along with the First Lady, Nancy Reagan, the administration instituted a rhetoric that closely resembled the happenings of the 1950s, idealizing suburbia and rural areas while denouncing urban plight and violence, when, in reality, centers of cities at this time were epicenters of cultural production and mixing of cultures, ethnicities, and other groupings. This approach can be seen through Reagan's Morning in America advert campaign.
It's morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history. With interest rates at about half the record highs of 1980, nearly 2,000 families today will buy new homes, more than at any time in the past 4 years. This afternoon, 6,500 young men and women will be married. And with inflation at less than half of what it was just 4 years ago, they can look forward with confidence to the future. It's morning again in America. And under the leadership of President Reagan, our country is prouder and stronger and better. Why would we ever want to return to where we were less than 4 short years ago?
This campaign referenced myths that closely correlated to the moralistic ethos of the American dream, centered on egalitarian myth, as J. Emmett Wynne defined in Moralizing Upward Mobility, investigating the myth of class mobility in Working Girl, putting the standard white male front and center, and embracing suburbia and rural areas while virtually ignoring cities. Overall, campaigns such as these reflected the overall fight, centered in rhetoric and other forms of propaganda, against multiculturalism and racial politics occurring in both the United States and the United Kingdom at this time, according to Roger Hewitt, who wrote about the 1980s and the change that occurred afterwards in his book, White Backlash and the Politics of Multiculturalism. In this essay, we will argue that despite trends of Hollywood that appeared to be multicultural on the surface in the 1980s, the industry did not do much to actually encourage multiculturalism, similarly to the Reagan administration. In its methods, however, it did set the foundation for multiculturalism to eventually be embraced and promoted in Hollywood, which came to be seen in the next decade. Here, I will be leading on from the lack of diversity we see in both government and film in the 80s, by exploring how Hollywood didn't actually defer all too much in the encouragement, or indeed lack of encouragement, in multiculturalism, and in fact how they were very similar. Furthermore, one can even go so far as to say that arguably the Reagan administration's handling of multiculturalism was so similar to Hollywood's handling of it that it can be argued that Hollywood, in some ways, mimicked the administration, with both focusing on encouraging militarism and masculinity instead of multiculturalism, and both having underlying values of extreme whiteness shown through symbolic acts. One can see how a vast amount of films in the 80s focused heavily on the white male hero. Uncompromising amounts of films almost always resorted in having a sole white male saving the day, and representing masculine values. Whether it be Batman, Mississippi Burning, Star Wars, or any Kurt Russell movie during the 80s, there was a prominent white male hero in a large majority of the blockbuster hits. Leading from this scholar, Susan Jeffords offers an explanation as to how during a time of rising movements associated with multiculturalism, Hollywood was reflecting the concerns of many citizens at the time. She states that Hollywood was making them acknowledge that there was still white male heroes who affirmed rather than rejected institutional structures underlying U.S. social operations, and that they provided a source of stability by retaining control of those institutions. Thus, here one can imply that Jeffords is stating that society at the time had an underlying fear that movements such as multiculturalism were threatening U.S. institutions, which had been embedded with white American culture, and that Hollywood was using lots of white male heroes in order to reassure the white middle class that the institutional structures in American society were not under threat by movements such as multiculturalism. Thus, here we have a clear case of Hollywood in fact discouraging multiculturalism. Furthermore, the 80s was a time of booming action movies, uncompromising in its masculinity, and it seemed to forgo an encouragement of multiculturalism, but rather an encouragement of militarism, something both Hollywood and the government seemed to be more inclined to encourage.
America. It's a great country. Protecting it is a great way of life. The United States Air Force. Find out how you can be part of it.
Jesus, this guy's good. Ghost, where's he going? Come on.
Films such as Top Gun, First Blood, Die Hard, or any film starring Arnold Schwarzenegger were very brass and unrelenting in its message of militarism and white male might. This was very concurrent with Reagan's huge tendency towards militarism and militarizing America. Here, we have things such as the Strategic Defense Initiative, militarization of police, and a new wave of increased funding to the U.S. military, most of which were largely reactionary measures to the Cold War. From here, one can state that in a time of heated tensions in the Cold War, and in a time with a president who prides himself on bravado, might, and masculinity, it is clear that multiculturalism was always going to take a backseat across America, and in its place, things such as militarism would be encouraged. Instead of a primal focus on the pressing issues of U.S. society, it can be argued that Hollywood followed suit with the Reagan administration and bombarded the American people with issues of militarism and masculinity. Thus, both the government and Hollywood showed a severe lack of encouragement on both ends to show and/or celebrate multiculturalism in the 1980s. Despite the government and Hollywood's shared absence of encouragement of multiculturalism in the media, this does not mean to say that there was none. Multiculturalism was indeed portrayed in American cinema of the 1980s, however, perhaps not in the way society had hoped. Just as the white male hero was represented as a convention of 80s film, racially diverse characters were also represented somewhat. However, it could be argued that they were not always positive or flattering portrayals. Within 80s film, the vast majority of characters from a different culture or ethnicity fell into a certain typecast, also known as stock characters. A stock character, by definition, is a stereotypical person whom audiences readily recognize from frequent recurrences in a particular literary tradition. They are a stereotype or archetype or category of a person, so consequently have readily become the subject of parody and are often criticized as cliches. According to scholars Paul Kiedis and Linda K. Fuller in their book Beyond the Stars, conventional secondary characters have long been an important component of formulaic popular films, and they are interesting and illuminating clues to their cultural milieu. However, whether intentionally or unintentionally, the culturally diverse characters present in many 80s films offered a representation which could have come across as arguably offensive and stereotypical. The typecasting of people of Asian descent, for example, generally fell into one of two categories: the scary Asian or the wacky Asian. Although opposites, both characterizations depicted the Asian culture as either villains or comedy roles, so something to be feared or something to be laughed at. Wong Duk Dong from 16 Candles, for example, epitomizes this. The very name of the character makes a mockery of the Chinese culture and language, and nearly a quarter of a century later led the film to be regarded as one of the most offensive Asian stereotypes Hollywood ever gave America. Also, the Indian cult features as the villains in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom are illustrated as mystical and almost sub-citizen characters, drinking blood and eating monkey brains and giant beetles. In addition, Alan J. Pakula's 1981 film Rollover portrays the Arab characters as the wrong kind of capitalists, the villains that should be disdained and feared, as opposed to the Caucasian Americans as the hero, to be celebrated and admired. The Arabs are shown to be a treacherous race that are secretive and plotting, with selfishly destructive attitudes and no possession of a civilized understanding of how to appreciate their good fortune and lifestyle. This strongly draws on the concept of Orientalist fear, visited in Tim John Semmerling's book, Evil Arabs in American Popular Film, which tackles Western society's fear of the unknown and the other, accentuated by the impact of Reagan's presidency and his ideas of white America. This inclusion of multicultural characters was undoubtedly the film industry's attempt to be politically correct and overtly advertise positive attitudes toward race. However, this essentially backfired and ultimately created token characters and promoted casual racism. Therefore, in some ways, this encouraged multiculturalism innocently, as many would agree that it was a way of celebrating certain cultures and their differences. But nonetheless, this was too overt, and in fact achieved the contrary. The American film industry, especially Hollywood, has been slated for its handling of multiculturalism in films during the 1980s, but was this for the good or bad? Was it good that different minorities were given roles in the film, as it opened the window for opportunity? Or was it deemed bad because the roles they were getting were offensive to their culture? Big Trouble in Little China was a movie that when released could have been praised or loathed. It didn't help that it was released a year after Year of the Dragon, which sparked protests and hatred from the Asian American community. Just before Big Trouble in Little China was released to the world, film critic Roger Ebert stated the film is one more example of the way every American ethnic group has been fodder for Hollywood's mill. He is referring to an ongoing theme of Hollywood creating misrepresented roles for different ethnic groups in America, similar to that of the Asian American characters in Big Trouble in Little China. But on the other hand, you could argue that these kinds of films opened up roles for Asian American actors. The CAACPA, or Chinese for Affirmative Action and Chinese Progressive Association, were not pleased with the fact that Chinatown in San Francisco was saved by a macho, smart-aleck white truck driver, Jack Burton. They were even angry with the fact that the film's production company, 20th Century Fox, never gave them the opportunity to review the film's script. Even the fact that Kurt Russell's Jack Burton came off as the hero caused outrage, as the actors who played Wang Shai and Egg Shen believed they were the real heroes. Although Dennis Dunn, who played Wang Shai, stated in Starlog, "I'm seeing Chinese actors getting to do stuff that American movies usually don't let them do. I've never seen this type of role for an Asian in an American film. This film can be seen to comically exaggerate Edward Said's Orientalism, in the sense that what a Westerner might perceive the East to be can be reversed in its overstatement of the Western film genre. Carpenter has been cited saying that he wanted the film to seem like a Western, meaning that the stereotypical gunslinging, macho Lone Ranger themes play with it. In response to the film, Henry Durr, the executive director of San Francisco's Chinese for Affirmative Action, said, "The main character is white. That's one thing we have to remember. It's a white script written for a white audience. The movie is still a white man's product." This contradicts what Peter Wong, who plays Rain, said about it being tongue-in-cheek and that it can't be taken seriously. This poses an interesting view as two people from the same ethnic group hold different opinions as to whether the film can be seen as encouraging multiculturalism or not. Does the fact that Peter Wong, who was involved in the filming process and therefore had a better understanding of the film's meanings, diminish what Henry Durr said? Or did it make his statement less prominent, as he felt obliged to be positive in order to help sell the film? A quote from the journal entitled "The Asian Invasion of Multiculturalism in Hollywood" read that Asian actors and filmmakers are not invading Hollywood, as much as they are finally being admitted into Hollywood, under very specific conditions for very specific roles. This reflects what the CAA-PCA was saying in that yes, Chinese American actors appearing in Hollywood films is on the rise, but the roles being given are misrepresentations of their culture. The 1988 film The Last Temptation of Christ, starring William Dafoe as Jesus, is deemed a classic, despite the public outcry it caused at the time of its release. Director Martin Scorsese stated that it was never my intention to shake anyone's faith, but rather to ignite faith. This comes after a group of militant Christians started a severe movement condemning the distributor Universal Pictures by staging a mock flagellation of Christ outside the home of one of the chairmen of the company. The effect of this resulted in several movie chains refusing to show the film. Despite the fact that Hollywood did attempt to some extent to portray multiculturalism, whether through tokenism or a genuine celebration of multiple cultures, they ultimately did not portray multiculturalism to a large extent, an extent that would be apt with the growing size of multiculturalism in America at the time. In turn, Hollywood can be seen to have taken an approach far more in line with the government's, that largely ignored the issue and instead pushed for a white, wholesome culture that celebrated and encouraged militarism and masculinity. As the 1990s commenced, the dot-com boom helped to provoke a time of large prosperity for America and its role in the world. In Washington, D.C., the elder Bush and Clinton administrations came to recognize the multiculturalism occurring across the country to a larger extent than the Reagan administration had, as movements that had started on the coasts made their way inland. Another wave of feminism began to gain power, and the fight against AIDS finally gained widespread recognition and support. In Hollywood, progress continued to be made, as minorities who had first come on screen in the 1980s began to gain support of their culture, as well as power and initiative. In the fields of sexuality, gender, and ethnicity especially, the 1990s marked an acceptance of multiculturalism and an optimism that transcended all boundaries in the country and would come to epitomize that decade of American prosperity.